Have you ever wondered exactly how much dignity fits into a cardboard box? The rain was biting that afternoon. It wasn't a heavy downpour, just a persistent, cold drizzle that turned the gravel of my driveway into a slick, muddy mess. There it was, my life, or at least the physical remnants of it, scattered across the wet asphalt like trash put out for collection. My antique bookshelf, the one my grandfather hand-carved, was leaning precariously against a stack of gym mats. A treadmill, heavy and imposing, sat exactly where my car was supposed to be. And then, there was the box marked, "Legal Documents." It was soaking through, the cardboard turning soft and pulpy, exposing the corners of folders that held the blueprints of my existence. Sarah and Mark were standing on the porch, their faces flushed with that particular, ugly shade of entitlement that only comes when people think they have finally won. They were shouting, their voices mixing with the sound of the rain, arguing about boundary lines and living space. Sarah was gesturing wildly at the garage, claiming that my belongings were an eyesore that prevented them from setting up their dream workout station. She looked at me, expecting a reaction. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to lose my composure, to start yelling, to beg them to put my things back, or perhaps to throw a punch so she could call the police and play the victim. Instead, I stood there, hands deep in my pockets, my posture perfectly relaxed. I didn't even blink when the water started dripping off the tip of my nose. I watched them like I would watch a bug caught in a spider's web. I wasn't angry. Anger is a waste of energy, a luxury for people who don't have a plan. I was calm, perhaps too calm for the situation. It unnerved them. I could see it in Mark's shifting eyes, and the way Sarah's voice started to crack, losing its edge of confidence. They were waiting for me to shatter, but I was busy taking inventory. People think that revenge is about making a grand gesture or causing a scene. They think it's about getting even in the moment. That is a mistake made by amateurs. Revenge, if done correctly, is a surgical procedure. It is about leverage, cold logic, and the systematic dismantling of a person's world using the very rules they thought they could ignore. I have spent the better part of my career as an estate attorney and a senior compliance auditor for a large private equity firm. My daily life is not filled with sunshine and smiles. It is filled with contracts, zoning laws, fiscal responsibility, and the messy reality of what happens when people decide to play fast and loose with the law. I spend 8 to 10 hours a day reading the fine print that no one else bothers to look at. I track money that has been misappropriated. I identify fraudulent signatures, and I navigate the labyrinth of property rights. I am the person you call when you need to know exactly why a deal fell apart, or more importantly, how to make sure the person who ruined it pays the maximum penalty. Being the boring one in the family has its advantages. While Sarah and Mark were out chasing get-rich-quick schemes and living a lifestyle they couldn't afford, I was building a fortress of stability. I understood the architecture of their greed. I knew exactly what they wanted, and more importantly, I knew exactly what they were capable of doing to get it. When I was called away on a 6-month international contract, I made the mistake of trusting them with the temporary care of my ancestral home. I thought family meant something. I thought that, at the very least, they would respect the sanctity of a home held in trust. But family is just a word. It is a biological accident that doesn't guarantee integrity. Standing there in the rain, watching them gloat, I didn't see a brother and a sister. I saw two people who had just signed their own professional and social death warrants. I wasn't just a homeowner standing in the mud. I was the person who knew where all the bodies were buried, and I had just realized that they were the ones who had dug the graves. As they continued to shout, oblivious to the reality of the situation, I simply adjusted my collar and looked at my watch. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms. I was going to beat them on mine. I looked up at them, keeping my voice steady, devoid of any warmth or rage, and spoke just one sentence. I told them they had 45 minutes to clear their things, because the sheriff was arriving at the hour. The look on their faces didn't change to fear immediately. It changed to confusion. They thought I was bluffing. They thought I was still the person they had pushed around for months. They didn't understand yet that the dynamic had shifted, that I had stopped being the victim and had become the auditor of their lives. They had thrown my belongings on the driveway to make room for a gym, but in doing so, they had given me the perfect environment to execute a plan that would take everything they had. The game had started, and they didn't even know the rules. 6 months earlier, the world had seemed a much simpler place. I had accepted a high-stakes contract overseas, a position that required my full attention and presence. The house, my ancestral home, was the only thing standing between me and total focus. It was an old place, filled with family history and legal protections that had been passed down through generations. I didn't want to sell it, and I didn't want it sitting empty for half a year. That was when Sarah and Mark stepped in. They were struggling, or at least they claimed to be. Their apartment lease was up, and they were looking for a place to bridge the gap. I offered them the house. It was a gesture of goodwill, a way to help family while ensuring the property was maintained. I gave them a set of keys, a list of maintenance contacts, and my full trust. That was my first mistake. In the first month, everything seemed fine. We exchanged polite messages. They sent pictures of the front lawn, the pristine porch, and the quiet neighborhood. It was the picture of domestic bliss. I felt reassured. I could work in peace, knowing that my home was in the hands of people I had known my entire life. But slowly, the pattern of communication began to change. The messages became infrequent. The photos stopped showing the house and started focusing on irrelevant things. A close-up of a new plant, a blurred photo of a corner of the living room, a slice of pizza on the counter. At the time, I attributed it to them settling in, to the busyness of daily life. I was wrong. I was being managed. The first real crack in the facade appeared in the 3rd month. Sarah messaged me, her tone deceptively casual. She mentioned that they wanted to do some minor renovations to the garage to make it a more usable space. It was framed as an improvement, something that would add value to the property. They asked for my permission to install a specialized floor, something for fitness training. I didn't think twice about it. Improving a property is generally a net positive, provided the work is done to code. I gave them the green light, assuming they would be working with licensed professionals and keeping me in the loop. That was when the invoice arrived. It was sent to my email, a digital document that claimed to be from a local contractor I had never heard of. The amount was staggering, $20,000 for a gym floor and some basic electrical adjustments. I looked at the numbers, and the math just didn't add up. I do this for a living. I read invoices, I verify expenses, and I spot discrepancies in my sleep. $20,000 for a residential garage upgrade in a suburban neighborhood was not just inflated, it was absurd. It was an anomaly that demanded an explanation. But instead of calling them out immediately, I did what I always do. I kept my mouth shut. I archived the invoice, and I started digging. I didn't reach out to Sarah. I didn't ask her why the price was so high. I reached out to the contractor, or rather, I tried to. The company name on the invoice didn't exist in the state database. The address listed was a vacant lot 2 towns over. The phone number was a VoIP line that was no longer active. It was a phantom document, a paper trail designed to look legitimate to an untrained eye, but completely transparent to someone who knew where to look. They were not renovating the house. They were siphoning equity. They were using my home as a collateralized ATM, pulling funds out under the guise of fake improvements, and they clearly thought I was too distracted by my work to notice. The betrayal wasn't just about the money, though that was bad enough. It was about the audacity. They didn't just want a place to stay. They wanted to strip the property of its value while I was gone. They were gambling that I would come back, see the improvements, and just write it off as a cost of doing business. They were gambling that I would prioritize family harmony over legal precision. The situation turned from a financial nuisance into a full-blown crisis with a single phone call. It was a Tuesday evening, rainy and dark, much like the day I eventually evicted them. My phone buzzed, and it was a name I hadn't seen in a while. Mr. Henderson, the neighbor who lived 3 houses down. He was a retired man, the kind who spent his days watching the street from his window. He called, not to chat, but to ask if I knew that there was a legal notice posted on my front door. I asked him what he meant. He told me that a clerk from the county office had stopped by to deliver a document regarding a quitclaim deed. He hadn't read it, of course, but he knew enough to know that it looked official and that it was filed under Sarah's name. A quitclaim deed is a legal instrument used to transfer interest in real property. It is the fastest way to change ownership. My heart didn't race. My blood didn't boil. I simply felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. They weren't just stealing cash. They were trying to steal the house. They had forged my signature, likely using a scanned document from my personal files, and were attempting to register the property in their own names. In that moment, the entire narrative of my relationship with them shifted. They weren't family in a crisis. They were criminals who had miscalculated the target. They thought they were dealing with a generous relative. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who spent his entire career identifying and dismantling exactly this kind of fraud. I sat in my office, looking at the screen, and I didn't feel rage. I felt a sense of anticipation. They had walked into a trap, and they didn't even know it. I had the documents, I had the timeline, and now I had the motive. The investigation had officially begun, and I had everything I needed to destroy them. The hunt began not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a mouse. Most people, when they suspect they have been wronged, react with noise. They call, they shout, they threaten. That is the quickest way to warn an opponent and give them time to cover their tracks. I did the opposite. I retreated into the silence. I needed to build a case that was bulletproof, not just against Sarah and Mark, but against any legal argument they might try to construct later. I treated my own house and my own family like an audit of a failing corporation. I started with the county clerk's online portal. It is a mundane tool, really, designed for homeowners to check property taxes or look up land surveys. It is not designed for criminal investigation, but in the right hands, it is a treasure map. I navigated to my property records and pulled the recent filings. My heart remained steady as I scrolled through the pages, but my eyes were sharp, scanning for the anomalies. There it was, buried under a generic property transfer header. A quitclaim deed. It was dated for the 2nd month of my overseas contract. The document was a piece of amateur work. I downloaded the PDF and zoomed in on the signature line. It was clearly a digital paste job, a copy of my signature clipped from a separate contract I had signed years ago and pasted onto the deed. It was slightly pixelated, the resolution a fraction lower than the surrounding text. To a clerk, just trying to finish their stack of papers, it might have looked fine. To someone who spends his life looking at audit trails, it looked like a flashing neon sign that said fraud. I saved the file, along with the timestamps of when it was filed. This wasn't just a petty family dispute anymore. This was document forgery. In this state, that is a felony. With the deed confirmed as a fraud, I turned my attention to the money. I needed to see where the funds from the renovation loan were actually going. I had set up a limited access account for Sarah and Mark, meant specifically for home maintenance expenses. It was supposed to be restricted to hardware store purchases and contractor payments. I logged into the bank portal and pulled the transaction history for the last 3 months. The pattern was almost laughably careless. The $20,000 transfer had been withdrawn in small, irregular chunks, not at a home improvement store, but at high-end retail outlets and electronics shops. They weren't paying for flooring or electrical work. They were paying for luxury items, new furniture, and perhaps the very equipment they were now setting up in my garage. It was a classic embezzlement profile. Small, frequent thefts disguised as large, necessary expenses. I exported every transaction, highlighted the discrepancies, and created a simple, chronological spreadsheet. It was a perfect timeline of their greed, complete with dates, locations, and amounts. Next, I turned to the Homeowners Association bylaws. These are the boring, dense documents that most people throw in the trash when they move into a neighborhood. They are tedious to read, filled with jargon about noise levels, fence heights, and zoning requirements. But for me, they were a weapon. I spent 3 hours reading the entire manual, specifically the section on residential home modifications. I found exactly what I needed. Any permanent addition that changes the use of a space from residential to commercial requires a special permit, a structural inspection, and approval from the board. A home gym of the size they were building, with commercial-grade equipment and rubber flooring, required soundproofing and specific electrical load permits. I looked at the photos they had sent me again. They had done none of it. They had turned my garage into a commercial-grade gym without a single permit, without a single inspection, and in direct violation of 3 different zoning codes. It was almost poetic. They thought they were building a dream gym, but they were actually building a monument to their own stupidity. They had created a physical, visual record of their own liability. If I were to alert the HOA or the city code enforcement, they wouldn't just be asked to move the equipment. They would be fined thousands of dollars, forced to restore the property to its original state, and potentially banned from future modifications. I spent the next 2 days compiling it all. I didn't use a chaotic folder of loose papers. I created a clean, professional binder. On the first page was the forged deed. On the second, the bank statements with the fraudulent purchases highlighted in red. On the third, the printed HOA bylaws with the specific violations circled. I wasn't just preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing a presentation. By the time I finished, it was late in the night. The house was quiet, and the glow of my monitor was the only light in the room. I looked at the binder, and for the first time, a small, cynical smile touched my lips. They had tried to outsmart me, to use my absence to strip the equity from my property and rebrand it as their own. They didn't understand that they were playing a game of checkers against someone who had spent his entire life playing chess with the law. I hadn't spoken to them yet. I hadn't let them know that I knew. I had maintained the silence, which is the most powerful tool in any auditor's arsenal. Every day that passed, they grew more confident. Every day, they dug their hole a little deeper. They thought I was coming home to a peaceful transition where I would thank them for their help. They had no idea that I was coming home with a binder full of evidence that would end their comfortable life and force them to face the consequences of their choices. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered, and the timeline was prepared. I had done the work. Now, it was time to collect. The day I returned, I didn't announce my arrival with a text message or a phone call. I simply unlocked the front door and walked in. It was a beautiful, crisp afternoon, the kind of day that feels like a fresh start for most people. For Sarah and Mark, it was the beginning of the end. I stepped into the foyer, and heard the sound of clanking weights in the garage. Their precious, illegal gym. They hadn't heard me come in. I took a moment to just stand there, taking in the scene. My house, which had been a sanctuary of peace and order, now smelled like stale sweat and cheap floor sealant. It was a jarring transformation, a visual representation of their total lack of respect for what they had been given. I walked into the living room, placed my briefcase on the table, and waited. It took them a few minutes to notice me. When Sarah finally walked in from the garage, wiping her hands on a towel, her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a practiced, defensive smile, the kind you use when you are caught doing something you shouldn't be doing. Mark followed a moment later, shirtless, looking confused and annoyed. They didn't see a threat. They saw the pushover relative they had been manipulating for months. They saw someone they thought they had already successfully cheated. "You're back early," Sarah said, her voice trying to sound casual, but failing. She was already mentally calculating how much time she had to hide the improvements. "I had some urgent matters to attend to," I said. My voice was level, measured, and completely devoid of the familial warmth they were expecting. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't ask about their day. I simply opened my briefcase and pulled out the binder. I slid the binder across the polished mahogany of the dining table. It made a solid, heavy sound, the sound of finality. "We need to discuss some discrepancies I found while I was away," I said. I spoke as if I were leading a routine performance review, not tearing their lives apart. Mark let out a laugh, a dismissive, arrogant sound. "Seriously? You're going to talk about business the moment you walk through the door? We're busy. We're training. And honestly, we're a little offended that you're worried about paperwork right now." I didn't react. I just watched him. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. "This isn't business, Mark. This is a forensic audit of your stay here." I opened the binder to the first page. The forged quitclaim deed. I tapped my finger on the signature line. "I found this filed with the county clerk. It's an interesting document. It claims I transferred ownership of this property to you 2 months ago. The only problem is that I never signed it. And since this is a legal document, filing a false signature is a felony. In this state, that comes with a mandatory prison sentence." The change in the room was instant. The air seemed to leave Sarah's lungs. Her eyes darted to the paper, then back to me. The arrogance drained out of her face, replaced by a pale, sickly realization. Mark stopped smiling. He leaned in, squinting at the document, his bravado crumbling faster than I expected. They were amateurs. They had never dealt with real consequences in their lives. And now, the reality of it was hitting them like a physical blow. It's a mistake," Sarah stuttered, her voice thin and shaky. "There must be some misunderstanding at the office. We didn't—" "Don't lie," I interrupted, my voice still calm, still steady. "It's a waste of both of our time. I have the digital trail of when the file was accessed from your laptop. I have the logs of the communication between your email and the clerk's office. I have the whole story." I turned the page to the second section, the bank statements. I pointed to the luxury purchases they had made with the maintenance funds. "And then there is the matter of the $20,000 you stole. You told me it was for home improvements. The receipts say otherwise. You spent the money on things that are currently sitting in that garage: embezzlement, grand larceny, and fraud. That's not a family dispute. That's a criminal record." Mark tried to stand up, his face reddening, probably hoping to intimidate me into backing down. "You can't do this," he barked, his voice rising in panic. "We're family. You're going to ruin our lives over some money and a misunderstanding?" "Family is what you respect," I said, standing up to meet his gaze. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I was the calmest person in the room, and that scared them more than if I had been screaming. You didn't treat me like family. You treated me like a mark. And now, you're going to find out what happens when you try to comp a professional. I reached for my phone on the table. It was the one-call moment. I didn't call the police yet. I called a local property enforcement officer, someone I had worked with on a dozen professional cases, a man who valued the letter of the law above all else. I put the phone on speaker so they could hear every word. "Officer, this is," I said, my tone professional and detached. "I need an enforcement team at my residence. I have proof of illegal property transfer, document forgery, and ongoing criminal trespassing. Yes, the evidence is gathered and ready for review. I'll be waiting for you." I hung up and looked at them. They were frozen, looking at me as if I were a stranger. They had come here to take everything I owned, and in 20 minutes, I had stripped away their safety, their plans, and their future. They were no longer the arrogant tenants who owned the house. They were two criminals, trapped in a room, waiting for the consequences to arrive. And the best part? They had done it all to themselves. They sat there in the heavy silence, the reality finally setting in that there would be no negotiation, no second chances, and no way out of the trap they had built for themselves. The arrival of the authorities was remarkably efficient. When you present law enforcement with a complete indexed binder containing evidence of forgery, theft, and clear zoning violations, the chaos usually associated with a dispute vanishes. They didn't see a family argument. They saw a cut-and-dry case of fraud. Within 20 minutes, my house was no longer a crime scene. It was an administrative process. Sarah and Mark were given a very narrow window to pack their personal belongings. They were not allowed to take the equipment they had purchased with stolen money, nor were they allowed to linger. Watching them pack was a lesson in human psychology. They were frantic, sweating, and desperate. They tried to bargain with the officers, claiming that they had contributed to the house, but their words fell flat against the reality of the documents I had provided. Mark tried to look at me, pleading for some kind of brotherly mercy, but I remained by the window, watching the rain stop. I didn't engage. I didn't offer a final word. When you decide to commit fraud against a professional auditor, you forfeit the right to a conversation. They were eventually escorted out, their belongings shoved into the back of a rental van, their exit as ungraceful as their actions had been. The legal consequences followed swiftly. Because I had the bank statements and the forged deed documented so precisely, there was very little for them to argue. They didn't end up in prison, but they didn't escape unscathed either. They were forced to take a plea deal that required them to make full restitution for the funds they had embezzled. To pay that back, they had to liquidate their own savings and sell off their personal assets. They were blacklisted from any future roles involving property management or financial trust. The felony label on their records ensured that they wouldn't be doing this to anyone else anytime soon. They lost their reputation, their credit, and, most importantly, the illusion that they were smarter than the world around them. The social fallout was perhaps the most final part of the process. In a family, secrets have a way of leaking, but lies have a way of rotting. Once the police reports were public record, I didn't have to explain anything to our relatives. I simply forwarded the documentation to the family group chat. I didn't add a message. I didn't need to add a commentary. The facts spoke for themselves. When the rest of the family saw the proof of the forgery and the theft, the sympathy Sarah and Mark had been counting on evaporated. They became social pariahs. They reached out to cousins and aunts, trying to spin a narrative of a misunderstanding or a harsh brother. But the truth is a hard thing to pivot away from when it is printed in black and white on legal forms. They spent the next 6 months being alienated by the very people they had tried to impress. Returning the house to its original state was a therapeutic exercise. I spent the next few weeks cleaning. I stripped the garage, removed the gym mats, and restored the electrical work. Every room I touched felt like I was reclaiming my own space. I removed the traces of their temporary, greedy presence. I repainted the walls they had scuffed and replaced the locks they had changed. By the time I was finished, the house felt silent again. Not empty, but peaceful. It was mine. People often ask me if I regret it. They ask if I would have preferred to just talk it out, to keep the peace, to keep the family unit together. They look at me as if I am the cold one, the unfeeling machine who chose to dismantle his own family for the sake of a few documents. But they don't understand the nature of trust. Trust is not a blind leap of faith. It is a calculated risk. I trusted them, and they showed me that my trust was a liability. Revenge, in this context, wasn't about causing pain. It was about enforcing the boundaries that were crossed. It was about proving that actions have consequences, and that no one, regardless of their bloodline, is immune to the truth. I learned a life lesson through this ordeal that I carry with me into every new contract and every new relationship. Calmness is a superpower. Most people live their lives in a state of reaction. They get angry, they get loud, they make mistakes because they are driven by the heat of the moment. If you can maintain your focus, if you can keep your observations sharp, and if you can keep your emotions separated from the facts, you can weather any storm. I didn't win because I was stronger than them. I won because I was more diligent. In the end, Sarah and Mark didn't destroy my life. They gave me a reminder of why I do what I do. I am an auditor. I look for the truth. I identify the errors, and I ensure that the balance is corrected. I don't look for trouble, but I am exceptionally good at handling it when it arrives at my doorstep. The house is quiet now. The driveway is empty, the lawn is mowed, and the documents are filed exactly where they belong. And that, more than anything, is the perfect ending to the story. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of justice. And for me, that is always enough.